Hi, Leah. It's an honor to have you on the Utopia podcast. You just released a book called Grilled, and you're the president of Mercy for Animals. Can you tell us about the book Grilled and your work as the president for Mercy for Animals?
First, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here on your podcast. I came up with the idea for the book about 3 years ago. I had been processing the journey I had been on, which really, first and foremost, is about ending factory farming and chicken farming in particular as one of the biggest causes of suffering on the planet. And I sat down to write the book because I wanted people to care more about chickens and take more chickens off of their plate. But the book ended up being more about my journey of crossing enemy lines and working with people who normally we see as opponents to this issue, and realizing there's a lot of progress that can be made when we find common ground with the so-called enemy. I'm the president of Mercy for Animals, which is one of the largest farm animal rights organizations. So we only work on farmed animals because we believe it's the leading cause of suffering on the planet. And if you think about the fact that farmed animals are sentient beings that can feel pain, can suffer, and just land animals, excluding fish, the majority of which are kept in horrific conditions. So this has been my life's purpose. I'm very honored to lead Mercy for Animals. We have 6 country offices. We're in 6 countries. We're in India, China, Brazil, Mexico, the United States, and Canada. These are the areas where factory farming dominates the most. And our mission is to construct a more compassionate food system. So we're really focused on the construct part, not just the destroy part. We're not just trying to destroy factory farming. We're proactively constructing a better way.
Yeah, I guess 80 billion, that's almost one animal each year per human that ever existed. So how did you choose this life mission to reduce animal suffering? What led you on this path?
Well, like most people, like most kids, I grew up loving animals, having a fascination with them. Most of us start with the dogs and the cats in our home. For me, it actually started with ducks. And I grew up in the swamps of Florida, and I had the privilege of watching duck families and their lives unfold in my backyard. So we lived on the Wekiva State Park, and these mother ducks would kind of come up and waddle up to my mother's prized flower beds. And no one was allowed to touch these flower beds except the mother ducks. And they used to flatten and mush around the flower beds until they made the perfect nest. And then she'd lay her eggs in this nest. And it happened to be just on the other side of the screen of my family's, back porch, screened in porch. And so my brother, sister, and I used to be able to lay on our bellies and watch these ducks hatch and go out into the river for the first time and see all kinds of dramas and things unfold in their lives. So I grew up absolutely thinking these were animals worthy of protection and love every bit as much as the dog Buster that I shared my home with. And there was no question in my mind. So I had a very privileged upbringing in that sense, where I had empathy, very strong empathy for birds, for what is now, what is called poultry in our food system. And I think they're very neglected in our food system. They're overlooked because they're not mammals. And so we think they're dumb. They don't suffer. They don't feel pain. They don't feel joy. Well, they feel all of those things, biologically proven, physiologically proven. We just chosen to look away. And I grew up really noticing that, caring about that, and that being very close to my heart and wanting to fix that problem in our food system.
And then how did you choose chickens in particular? So I guess the major factory farmed animals would be cows, pigs, chickens, turkeys, and ducks. And then how did you hone in on chickens out of that equation?
Out of all farmed animals, so the United States raises and slaughters about 10 billion farmed animals per year. Out of that 10 billion, 9 billion of them are just chickens raised for meat. So 90% of all farmed animals that we raise and slaughter annually are meat chickens.
Wow.
They're called broilers in the industry. So when you talk about the meat, dairy, and egg industry, you're essentially talking about the meat chicken industry. Almost everything else is just totally overshadowed. So as a very pragmatic and empirically minded person, I thought if I want to have the greatest impact on reducing suffering on the planet, this was clearly the one species to work on. All of them matter, they really do, and they suffer to different degrees in the systems we've created to make them efficient for meat, egg, and dairy production. But this is by far, in terms of numbers of individuals that suffer, in terms of land animals, this overshadows everything else. You talk about fish, that's a whole other story. We get in the trillions with fish.
And do you think there are different levels of sentience between these animals? And does sentience and pain even correlate? Or could something be lower sentience and still feel as much pain as a different type of animal?
Well, I don't think that's a good question to ask, and I've been asked it before. I think that it doesn't matter can they think, or the level. It's do they suffer or not is the question. And we can't really quantify, and many people have tried to quantify degrees of suffering. The question is, do they or do they not? One thing science has tried to do, the animal welfare scientific world has tried to do, is maybe try to measure pain and when does pain occur. So for a broiler, which is the meat chicken, the part of their suffering is mostly related to the breed that they are. So through decades of selective breeding, they have been bred to grow really, really fast, really big, so that by 40 days, they're full slaughter weight. They're still babies, but they're in these ginormous bodies that really overburden them metabolically. So what you have is these giant breasts on these brittle bones and overtaxed hearts, lungs, and organs. And they're suffering tremendously from this. And so science has measured when does this pain set in. And they can do different ways to measure that. And as early as 7 days old, they're starting to have pain. And they're aware of this, they suffer. We know that they're suffering because there have been tests done on preference testing. It's usually what animal welfare scientists try to do. They give them two choices and they say which ones do the animals want. So in the case of broiler chickens, these meat chickens, they gave them feed that has a kind of aspirin in it to reduce pain, to help them feel better, and one without. And over a very short period of time, the birds were all choosing the feed with aspirin in it. And they've done other tests where if they give them aspirin, they get through an obstacle course faster, also indicating they're in pain, that there's difficulty, and they're moving slower and they're taxed by their bodies. So, I think the question of sentience is, not if they can think or are they smart, but do they suffer? And if that's a yes or no, do they or do they not? Are they a rock or are they a chicken? And right. if they're in the latter where they can, then we have a moral responsibility to reduce that. And then even if it's a small amount, when you're talking about 9 billion animals, you do the math and it's very, very significant.
And furthermore, I guess, are we even capable of perceiving their sentience? Because they certainly have things that they can do that we can't perceive. Like a very basic example is that animals have like a really strong pattern recognition through smell. And then if they were to evaluate us on that metric, we would be totally inept at detecting other human beings through smell.
I talk about that in my book about an author named Frans de Waal, who is a primatologist, and he's written a bunch of books about the evolution of our morals, our politics, of compassion, of empathy, and of these being evolutionary necessities for us to survive. But he wrote a book recently called Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are?, which addresses exactly what you're talking about. And he refers to something called an animal's umfelt, which is their very unique perception of the world that we could never have. Like I can basically estimate what your experience is, but I really couldn't understand or put myself in the shoes of a chicken. And the reason is the chickens can do things we can't do. They can see things. They can see colors we can't see. They can orient themselves in the magnetic fields of the planet, of the earth. Right. They can see both far away and close at the same time. And so when you think about things like that, if they were in charge of the world, they would possibly consider us to be really stupid because we can't do any of those things. And it'd be like if dolphins were in charge of the world and they measured us on our ability to, use echolocation. We have a very warped understanding of what intelligence is. It's according to our own intelligence, and we measure intelligence based on our intelligence. And I mean, we can't fly, we can't use echolocation, we can't orient ourselves in a magnetic field, we can't see, we have a very limited color scope. So,
Right.
I think that those are important things for us to review when we're saying that animal's not smart. And also, why does that matter? The main question is, do they suffer?
At least in terms of sentience, it's a warped metric system. So it's a warped scale that we're measuring other species on.
Yeah, and I think because chickens and fish are not mammals, we ignore them more, or we set them aside as unintelligent or not worthy of protection. They don't have vocalizations like we do when we're in pain or joyful. They don't have facial expressions of any kind. So these are important things for us to recognize in ourselves as we judge our treatment of other non-human animals.
So currently the problem is that chicken production is at 9 billion in the US, and then worldwide it's at 50 billion. So how do we get that number to zero in the long term, and what steps do we take along the way?
So that's a really good question. And I think people they underestimate how much we have to work towards reduction. And I'm not talking, individually, we're talking about by 2050. So we did a math model and we looked at if today, so right now we eat about 80 billion farmed animals. We raise and slaughter 80 billion farmed animals. If we wanted to get that number to half, how much less would an individual have to eat globally? And of course, the answer isn't half, because the human population is growing so radically, and we're supposed to be 10 billion people by 2050, right? Mm-hmm. So what it actually means is in the United States, if we want to half the number of farmed animals today by 2050, when the population is so much greater, is 10 billion, we're going to have to eat 90% less than we eat today. So just 10% of what we eat today. And that's only to get half the number of farmed animals. I think we have to really be radical in our approach in terms of accepting the reduction targets that are needed. When I think of the pace of change in the market now, I'm very hopeful though. When you see the Impossible Burger and Burger King, you see KFC trying Beyond Chicken and testing it out, and that being a very positive and well-received test done in Atlanta. The chicken sold out in 5 hours when it was supposed to last for 2 weeks. That's how popular it was. Those are really good signs that the market is ready and there is demand. And if you ask me, do I think in 5 years that half of the population will be vegetarian in the United States? The answer is no. But do I think half of the meals could be vegetarian? Yes. And I think we have to focus on that, like very serious reduction targets and making them wherever we can. And of course, going vegan is the best option for animals and the planet and your health, but also accepting any step that gets us towards that reduction of the total number of animals being kept in these circumstances.
At your heart, you're an idealist, but you're also a pragmatist. So you've kind of taken steps to empathize with the enemy, who is someone you might traditionally dislike or even hate, and you've kind of taken their viewpoint. So how have you gone about that? Because you've partnered up with farms and farmers and taken their empathetic viewpoint as well.
The first time I did this was the scariest time, and it was not the plan necessarily. So this was in 2014. I had been trying for a good number of years to get images out of a chicken factory farm and had not been able to. And I was trying to do this legally and openly and making requests and calling companies and saying, I just want to see what it looks like. And you'd think I was asking to see a biohazard like site or something like a nuclear waste site. And this is like where America's most popular protein is being produced, but it was closed. Like nobody could see it. And it had been 10 years since an undercover investigation had shown what this looked like. 10 years, yeah. 2004 was the last time before I worked on this issue that the inside of a factory farm had been revealed in an undercover investigation. They're really hard to get into. So when I had the opportunity through a journalist to meet a chicken factory farmer, he invited me onto his farm, and I didn't know why he had invited me. I didn't know why he was willing to meet with an animal advocate who usually were total enemies in the public eye. But I thought, you know what? I've tried every other avenue. I'm out of choices here. And this is my job, is to reveal this. And I went with a camera and my friend Reagan Hodge, who's a filmmaker. And I was very nervous. I remember giving my husband the address and saying, if I don't come back, look for me buried in the chicken litter. I'm probably going to be rotting away in there. And thinking it was an ambush by the farmers. I thought that I really, in my head, like imagine a bunch of farmers with pitchforks waiting for me, you know, like a Disney scenario. What I found out when I met with him was that he hated the system too. And this was a big shock to me. So my fear was replaced with being ashamed of myself for not having considered this human being that was also feeling trapped in the system like the chickens and not knowing a way out. So to explain what I mean by that, Craig Watts is the farmer I met with. And when he was like 22 years old, he was living in rural North Carolina and he wanted to stay on the land. His family had been there for 5 generations. The tobacco industry had just totally bottomed out and there were no other jobs. And then the chicken industry came to town and offered him a contract. And they said, all you have to do, this is the catch, is get $250,000 loan out from the bank. And if you do, then you can raise chickens for us. And when you raise each flock, you'll get a paycheck, and that paycheck can pay off the loan, like a mortgage.
Right.
And it was very prearranged, this loan. So it's with a private bank, but with the contract from the company, it was very easy to achieve. So he did it. And it went really well at first. He would raise the chickens, he'd get his paycheck, he'd pay off the mortgage, and he was kind of chipping away at that big loan. But then the chickens got sick because it's a factory farm. And 25,000 chickens, wall to wall, living on litter that has their own feces that's never changed, ammonia-laden air, with, you know, a disgusting, dirty environment. And when birds get sick and they die, he doesn't get paid for those chickens. So that's money out of his pocket, which meant the paycheck started to get smaller, but the loan remained the same. And so after a while, he knew he had made a mistake, but there was no way out. And he got scared. He didn't know what to do. And he also was getting fed up with what he felt. He said the consumer was being hoodwinked. They thought it was something better than it was. And that was about the time that he and I met. And he had had enough. And when we spoke, I really remember thinking, I was ashamed of myself for never thinking about his problems, his struggle, why he had signed up for this, and why he kept doing such a horrible job. And I realized he felt as trapped as the chickens do. And in that, I found a very unlikely ally that ended up being a very powerful force for giving a megaphone to this issue.
It sounds like they really got him early and then trapped him in a cycle of debt. So it sounds similar to a loan shark situation. Has any thought been given to maybe like a microfinance or microloan solution where these farmers are helped transition to farming a different type of substance?
That's a great question. So first of all, American contract chicken farmers collectively owe $5 billion right now. And many of them go bankrupt, and it's not an easy problem to solve. The amounts are crazy. Like, I can't imagine taking out, when I was 22 years old, somebody just going, here's $250,000. You know,
Right.
it's a very, very specific system that's been set up. In terms of transitioning farmers, I am working on this at Mercy for Animals right now, and we're hoping to launch a project in the new year, which would be really helping farmers transition and workshopping this idea. So one farmer I've been working with is named Mike Weaver, and later after Craig Watts, I did a very similar thing with him and another gentleman named Eric Hendrick, and they both were working for Pilgrim's Pride at the time, which is a very large chicken company owned by JBS. And they were fed up. They had disease in their flocks. They couldn't get rid of it. It was this horrific disease called gangrenous dermatitis, which eats the birds from the inside out. It's like a bacteria that turns the birds into this gelatinous pulp within 24 hours. Horrific. And you can't get rid of it once in your flock. And they had no help. And they were really, again, that financial part of it was really difficult. One of those farmers went bankrupt, and he has 3 daughters going to college, like really tough. The other farmer, so we did an expose. We showed, it was in the New York Times. We showed the problems that were occurring. And one of the farmers, as I said, went bankrupt. And the other farmer is transitioning to hemp. And it turns out that the conditions for raising chickens are very similar to those necessary for hemp.
Oh,
He has taken the same warehouses, the farmers that they used to raise the chickens in, and he's now putting in hemp, like grown in a kind of, with artificial lights, and he's going to make way more money that way. So the same houses, he had 2 houses where he would raise, 60,000 birds at a time, 30,000 in each, something like that. And now, and he used to make $30,000 a year, and now he's going to make $600,000 a year when it's up and running. There are other opportunities. So a mushroom farming is a big one that we're thinking through, even hydroponic lettuce, or other, there are a lot of alternatives on the market that are coming up. And our job as advocates, as I said at the beginning of the conversation, is not to just destroy a system, it's also to construct a new one. So we're really trying to think about a constructive approach to this, where we're not going in as advocates and going into these rural parts of America and going, we want to get rid of your jobs in your industry. We want to say, like, we want to transition you into something everybody feels good about. And we're all in this, it's a win-win. And so instead of thinking about how can I put these farmers out of business, now I'm thinking about how can they be farmers for a new industry, for the emerging products on the market, whether it be an alternative protein or hemp or cannabis, even in some states is possible. Those are all options.
Yeah, I mean, these farmers are not bad people. I guess at least they don't want to be on the wrong side of history. So it's really about giving them an economically viable counter solution to factory farming.
I think everybody is constrained by economics, even at the meat industry level, and even in these big fast food chains or supermarkets. It's all about economic constraint. And so you have to try to think of alternatives within those economic constraints, and you'll be a lot more successful if you can propose solutions that fall within that framework that they're already thinking in.
So that story was on an individual farmer level, and you've also done some really crazy work with even large-scale corporations. Like you've worked with Perdue Farms, which is the 4th largest chicken production in the US. So what was your work with them, and what was the final solution?
So with Perdue was the farm that Craig was raising for. And at first they were very uncommunicative with me. So for a year they stonewalled me and wouldn't talk. But fast forward a year and a half later, and I ended up being in that uncomfortable place again and sitting down with someone I never thought I would work with. And that was Jim Perdue himself and his team. And he had been the villain of my viral video. So that was frightening to do, but I felt like we had to do it. That at the end of the day, I'm not in charge of a single chicken, and they're in charge of 680 million chickens. So the opportunity to be heard by them was critical. And if they really were, we care about these chickens, and we can find some common ground where we can reduce the suffering of the animal. We worked with them, and over a year, we worked on their first animal care policy. So this was when I was at Compassionable Farming, but Mercy for Animals was also at the table along with HSUS. And we put out in 2016 the first animal care policy. And they addressed some of the very things that we had criticized them in the video for not doing, like putting windows into the houses of these warehouses so that natural light could shine through. And they even paid for it in some of the cases. This was huge. And they have a lot more progress to make, but the fact that they were willing to listen and sit down with us and continue to listen, I think it shows the power of entering that uncomfortable zone and talking to the enemy, where you can really make progress. Even if it's hard and uncomfortable and scary, I think it's important to do. So this is a hard thing to imagine. And the story I'll tell you is one conversation I had with John Mackey, who is the CEO of Whole Foods. Wow. And I asked, when I was writing this book, I interviewed a lot of different people, and I talked to him, and I said, well, and the question I would pose is, what do you think 2040 will look like? And I'm fishing basically for, is it the end, right? Yeah. And different people have different answers. But I thought he gave the most interesting answer. And he said, what was 20 years ago like? There were no iPhones, there was no Google, the
Yeah.
internet barely worked. Like, we cannot imagine the technological advances. We actually can't imagine them, because we couldn't imagine that we'd have like our own computer system that we carry around all the time that is the global brain. There are things that we can't imagine. So if you even imagine 20 years from now, we're wrong. Whatever we're imagining is incorrect. And the acceleration of change because of technology, we're in this big technological advancement. As you know, there's been different advancements throughout society, whether it be the Industrial Revolution, the Renaissance. Like, we're in the technological revolution right now, and so the advances in the next 20 years are very difficult to predict. But I do have a lot of faith in those technological advances, like clean meat, which is where meat is produced from animal cells and no animals are slaughtered in the process. That feels like a light at the end of the tunnel. If we crack that, it will be the end. It will be the end for sure. And there's other advances, I think. Some of the plant-based technology, plant-based alternatives and proteins are so similar. People can't tell the difference, and they're so much better for you. So the thing that John Mackey did tell me he thought you could start to predict is and he kind of pointed to his watch, which was a little, calculating his steps and things like that. And he's like, we're going to have technology very soon that monitors our health precisely on what we eat. Mm. And the evidence is super clear. Eating animals is not good for you. It's not good for you. Like, eating excessive amounts of farmed animals is not good for you. And when I say excessive, I mean, like, maybe you should eat 5% of your meals would be okay, but not even necessary, you know? And once people have a bite of their hamburger and then they see what's happening to their blood work, and that's visible to them immediately, it will stop. It will just stop. So he felt that the technology around health monitoring is really going to shift our habits, and that for sure we're going to eat a lot less animals, strictly because of the health implications, and our knowledge base around that really moving us towards a plant-based whole foods diet. And I thought that was a very interesting way to look at it.
Essentially, because of some sort of feedback loop for health, maybe at least from a self-interest perspective, people, if they can see that eating this will lead to higher cholesterol, from a self-interest perspective, they may cut back on meat consumption. So it may be a feedback loop and happen quicker than we think it will.
I mean, there's a lot of technology developing like that, and I would watch that space. I think that will have a really interesting, the reason a lot of people go plant-based is health. That's when we do our searches and data, it's because of self-interest, and that's who we are as a species, right? So that feedback has helped a lot of people make that transition, whether they're trying to lose weight or they have heart disease or they have obesity, they have diabetes, all of these things, cancer. A lot of these things are linked to not eating enough of a plant-based whole food diet. So, for example, my dad had a heart attack a year ago, and this is a man. He's doing well now, but this is a man who swam a mile 5 times a week, 165 pounds. Super active, super smart, and he's swimming in the pool one day, has these pains, lucky he didn't drown, and he had a heart attack. And, two of his arteries were 40% closed and the other one was almost entirely closed, very strictly because of his diet. So you can have a really healthy life and otherwise think you're doing awesome and checking all the boxes, but it is categorically bad for you to eat large amounts of animal products. And I think the feedback on that is becoming clearer and clearer. So both of my parents have moved to a primarily plant-based diet. They've really reduced their, because he doesn't want to live on drugs, as for the rest of his life. And a lot of people feel that way. And I think there's more and more people hearing those stories, having family members with heart disease. And then we have Bill Clinton, who, was one of the kind of most advertised people who had heart disease and then totally reversed it by going plant-based. And
oh, really?
I think those are really important signals in society when you have, we have 2 presidential candidates right now that are vegan.
Really?
Cory Booker and Tulsi Gabbard are vegan.
Oh, okay.
And I think we're starting to see the first signs of this becoming a much more dominant diet. But I think self-interest is a big factor. But luckily that's just factually correct. And also the plant-based options are coming up behind it, making it more convenient and tasty, and the price point is getting better for us to be able to choose that more easily. Changing the way people eat is a critical solution to our species surviving. You know, the planet will survive. We just might not, and a lot of other animals and will not either. The way, if we keep going the way we are. You know, the problem is, I think, with the health is a lot of people will just use medicine to fix that if they have the means. So they'll just like get on their beta blockers and they'll get on their whatever, and that will to some degree could mask the problem if they don't want to solve it themselves. If it's a reactionary rather than a preventive kind of thing. And that's why I think the technological solutions are so critical. So coming in as fast as we can with the cell-based meat and the plant alternatives and meeting people where they're at the same time as educating them about the impact. I think some of the things that are happening now, the conversations at the UN and global leadership level are really important too. Just recognizing that animal agriculture is a key factor in climate change, and we have to have global policies and leadership address that and curtail things like subsidies and other government policies that not only allow this to persist, but to thrive. It only thrives because we list it as an important commodity that we subsidize. Now, what happens if we stop subsidizing that and subsidize the growth of cell-based meat and plant-based meat? It will really change the dynamic of the food offerings to us and the price point of those, which is primarily the way people choose their food is on price point.
And this is maybe a difficult one to answer, but let's say that we like improve or reduce suffering of chickens domestically, and then that means that they can produce less chickens each year domestically. Assuming demand stays the same, would more chickens be raised abroad?
California passed last year Prop 12, and Prop 12 banned the production of animals from caged and crated systems, but also the sale of products from those systems. So they're not just banning the system as the animals are raised in the state, but any product in the state has to meet these minimum requirements on animal welfare. So, and that's a something that happens throughout Europe, for example, where there are minimum standards required to sell in Europe. And those are based, and those have been challenged at the World Trade Organization, but when you have ethical considerations, they can override those challenges. And so if a country decides this is our ethical limit, this is where we have set the standard, I think that can prevent the import. And it actually accelerates or can trigger change in other countries because they want to sell into these countries, and those market forces and that the desire for like a minimum food safety or a minimum animal welfare or a minimum environmental standard or even workers' rights standard, in order to sell into that market, you have to meet these standards. And so it can actually improve standards in another country. So I think it actually could have the reverse effect of what you're saying, is a rising tide, brings all ships up. And that would be the concept of other countries like China look to Europe to say, what are the standards if we want to sell there? How do we meet those standards? And they do that already on food safety issues. And if we follow that pattern, animal welfare will follow that too.
I see your point. So it just doesn't affect domestic. Basically, any sale of chickens in a certain area has to follow the same regulations. So even people raising abroad would have to make those changes.
California, that was the law that was passed last year. So and that means any state in the United States now has to meet. If they want to sell into California, they have to be cage-free eggs. And this is now will hopefully create enough of a conversation between states and in companies that the companies say, you know what, I'm going to make it's easier for us to go cage-free all around. Because California purchases 25% of the country's eggs, right? So that's going to affect the entire market when you do something like that, and it will cause this ripple effect. And the United States is such a big consumer, of everything globally, that if we change the pattern of the way animals are raised here, I think it can really have a ripple effect. There is the risk if we don't pass those laws and there can be this where consumption and production increase in other countries. So it could be that Brazil and China don't meet these standards, which are two big countries of production, and we need to be in those countries. And so, Mercy for Animals is building offices, building a presence, building grassroots and collaborations in those countries, because you can't, it is ineffective to work in one country and you need to work in the countries where the most number of animals, and China houses half of the world's farmed animals.
Wow.
So we have to be there. We have to be working on it.
So at the end of your book, Grilled, you have a really beautiful vision for the future where you kind of are, you're driving around your grandchildren, and basically you've finished your work such that you've put yourself out of business. Mercy for Animals no longer needs to exist. Can you tell us about that vision for the future that we might experience in 30 years?
I feel very happy thinking about that, that future. Well, I think in the book, I have an epilogue where I imagine that it's 2050, and I'm driving in North Carolina with my grandkids, and they ask me, what are these dilapidated houses? And I say those used to be chicken warehouses, and we used to think it was a good idea to stuff sentient beings wall to wall in a house and raise them like this and eat protein that way. And my grandkids are kind of perplexed and can't believe it. In the same way, we look back and go, I can't believe like athletes used to smoke, like Babe Ruth was a smoker, And the same way we look back at these definitely unhealthy, unsustainable, irrational industries. I imagine my grandkids looking back and thinking that. And I think, thank goodness we didn't do that. Like, we almost destroyed the planet. We almost burned the light bulb out of the planet because of this really silly idea of how to produce protein. And now we have, of course, these really efficient, clean ways to produce protein that don't involve killing a single animal. And that's kind of the future I imagine. And I imagine we've all don't have to do advocacy anymore and we've all maybe started working in these plant-based clean meat technologies instead. And I'm happily retired and get to and my kids, when they go to the supermarket or look at the menu, they don't have to struggle with these choices like we all do, where we're like, is this the right thing to eat? I don't know. The labels are confusing. And I say there's only good choices on the shelf now, and they can worry about other things. And I really hope that day comes. That's what I keep in my mind.
Yeah.
No, that's an incredible vision. It's really that or all humans go extinct. I'm hoping that your vision comes true.
I hope so too. I really hope so too. Because, the planet will carry on. People are like, save the planet. And it's like,
The planet will do fine, humans won't.
And also many millions and animal species will not be fine. So the hope is that we can fix that before it's too late.
Cool. And then to end the interview on a very eccentric question. So there's really two forms of animal suffering, right? One is human induced that we have control over, and the other is nature induced. So in the very long term, as Peter Singer writes about this, he says that, just by the nature of evolution, there's a lot of predator-prey relationships. So in the very long term and kind of an eccentric view, do we think we want to rewrite evolution in nature such that there aren't any predator-prey relationships in nature, or would that be possibly too dangerous because we could upset a balanced system?
Well, in my work, I work with a lot of, I really do think about the effective altruist framework. I really do think about suffering, and the idea of wildlife suffering and like invertebrate suffering just is an overwhelming idea of, if that is correct, is where the most suffering would be happening on the planet. And correcting that requires us to have a different framework than we have now. And so I don't really know the answer to that question. I just focus on the tractable problems and the things we're causing, the suffering we are directly causing. I hope we get to a stage when that's the suffering that we need to worry about.
Right.
I think our focus needs to be on ourselves as a species and the suffering we are causing directly because of our behavior on the planet. and our choices, which we can choose differently. And that's where our priority should be now.
Agreed. Yeah. Let's focus on human suffering and then revisit the rest in 100 years if we're still around.
Yep.
Sounds great. Leah, it was such an honor to have you on Utopia. I definitely learned a lot, and thank you for sharing your story with us.
Oh, thank you, Vishal. It was really great conversation. Really interesting.
Thank you so much.